Between 1941 and 1945, 5 British gentlemen passed more than 20,000 classified documents to Soviet intelligence. They weren't captured agents or coerced defectors. They were the cream of British society: Cambridge graduates, MI5 officers, diplomats, art historians serving the Queen. For nearly 3 decades, they operated at the heart of the British establishment while systematically dismantling it from within. The Cambridge Five didn't just steal secrets. They stole something far more valuable: the assumption that loyalty, education, and privilege guaranteed trustworthiness. This is the story of how the British establishment discovered that its most dangerous enemies weren't the ones who looked different or spoke with foreign accents, but the ones who spoke with perfect Oxford accents and attended the right dinner parties. In January 1951, American cryptanalysts working on a project codenamed Venona made a discovery that would shatter transatlantic intelligence cooperation for a generation. Buried in decrypted Soviet communications from 1945 was evidence that someone codenamed Homer had been transmitting atomic secrets from inside the British Embassy in Washington. The Americans didn't know Homer's real identity, but they knew 3 things about him. He had worked in New York during the war, his wife had been pregnant in 1944, and he had access to the most sensitive Anglo-American nuclear cooperation. The FBI shared this information with exactly one person at Britain's Secret Intelligence Service: Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known to friends as Kim. Philby was the perfect liaison officer. Educated at Westminster School and Cambridge, son of the legendary Arabist Harry St. John Philby, trusted absolutely by both British and American intelligence services. He had impeccable credentials, flawless instincts, and access to everything the Americans knew about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence. What the Americans didn't know was that Kim Philby was himself a Soviet agent, had been since 1934, and that he immediately recognized Homer as his fellow Cambridge spy, Donald Maclean. Philby faced a calculation. Maclean would be interrogated soon, probably within weeks. Once questioned, Maclean might confess, might name names, might expose the entire network. The most important Soviet intelligence operation in history could unravel because American codebreakers had gotten lucky with old messages. Philby needed to warn Maclean, but he couldn't do it directly without exposing himself. He needed an intermediary, someone already compromised, someone the British wouldn't immediately connect to him. He chose Guy Burgess, the 3rd member of their Cambridge circle. Guy Burgess was everything an intelligence officer shouldn't be: flamboyant, alcoholic, sexually indiscreet, and spectacularly undisciplined. He collected parking tickets the way other diplomats collected commendations. He showed up to Foreign Office meetings drunk, insulted ambassadors at diplomatic receptions, and maintained relationships with known communists while serving in positions requiring absolute discretion. Yet somehow he kept getting promoted, kept getting access, kept moving through the corridors of power, as if his obvious unsuitability for intelligence work made him invisible to the people who should have been watching him most carefully. In spring 1951, Burgess was serving at the British Embassy in Washington, sharing an apartment with Philby. The arrangement should have raised immediate suspicions. 2 British intelligence officers, both with questionable associations, living together in the American capital, while one of them had access to the most sensitive counterintelligence operations. But the British establishment operated on assumptions about character that made such scrutiny seem unnecessary. Men who attended Cambridge, who spoke properly, who knew the right people and wore the right ties, were presumed trustworthy. The idea that such men might systematically betray everything their class represented was literally unthinkable. Philby engineered Burgess's recall to London by ensuring he accumulated enough minor infractions to require disciplinary action. Once back in England, Burgess was to deliver a simple message to McLean: run. The Americans were close to identifying Homer, and once identified, McLean would be arrested, interrogated, and probably convicted. The only option was immediate defection to the Soviet Union. The plan was that Burgess would warn McLean, then return to Washington to maintain his cover and deflect suspicion from Philby. What actually happened revealed both the strength and weakness of the Cambridge network. On May 25, 1951, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean boarded the evening ferry from Southampton to Saint-Malo, France. They arrived in France shortly after midnight on May 26th, then disappeared. By the time British authorities realised they had fled, both men were beyond reach, travelling through France and Switzerland towards Soviet territory. Burgess wasn't supposed to defect. His departure with McLean immediately pointed suspicion toward the one person who connected them, Kim Philby, who had roomed with Burgess in Washington and who had been the last British officer to see the FBI's Venona materials before McLean fled. But Burgess had apparently concluded that returning to London after warning McLean would be too dangerous, that questions would be asked he couldn't safely answer, that his own involvement would eventually be discovered. So he ran, and in running, he nearly destroyed Philby's cover. Nearly, but not quite. The public revelation that two senior Foreign Office officials had defected to Moscow triggered what the press called the Great Betrayal. Newspapers demanded investigations. Politicians called for resignations. The Americans suspended intelligence cooperation with Britain until they could be assured that British security services weren't completely compromised. And attention focused immediately on Kim Philby, who was recalled from Washington, stripped of his position as MI6 liaison to American intelligence, and subjected to intense interrogation. The interrogations occurred over several months in 1951 and 1952, conducted by MI5 officer Helenus Milmo, a barrister known for forensic precision in questioning. The transcripts, declassified decades later, show a chess match between interrogator and suspect. Milmo knew Philby was guilty, but had no proof, only circumstantial evidence and suspicious patterns. Philby knew he was guilty, but had to maintain absolute consistency in his denials while appearing cooperative and forthcoming. "I've known Guy Burgess for years," Philby told Milmo. "That doesn't make me a Soviet spy. Half of Cambridge knew Burgess. Are we all traitors?" The logic was sound but missed the point. The question wasn't whether knowing Burgess made someone guilty. The question was whether someone with Philby's access, connections, and opportunities could have remained innocent while associating with people who turned out to be Soviet agents. Milmo pressed on aspects of Philby's history that suggested recruitment by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s. His marriage to a known communist, his time in Vienna during the rise of fascism, his convenient conversion from apparent communist sympathies to conventional conservatism just as he began his intelligence career. "Your political evolution was remarkably well timed," Milmo observed, almost as if someone had advised you that overt communist sympathies would prevent you from infiltrating British intelligence. Philby had answers for everything. His communist phase had been youthful idealism, abandoned when he matured and understood the realities of Soviet totalitarianism. His wife's politics had been her own, not his. His career path had been shaped by opportunities that arose naturally, not by Soviet direction. Every question had a plausible answer. Every suspicious pattern had an innocent explanation. And critically, Milmo had no documentary evidence, no intercepts, no confessions from other sources that could definitively prove Philby's guilt. After months of interrogation, MI6 asked Philby to resign. The request was framed as procedural necessity, not accusation. "Given the circumstances," they told him, "and the damage to Anglo-American relations, we feel it's best if you step away." Philby resigned in July 1951, received a modest settlement and was informed that while he was no longer employed by MI6, certain elements within the service still believed in his innocence and would provide informal financial support if needed. This extraordinary arrangement, disclosed decades later, revealed the fundamental problem with British intelligence security. The establishment couldn't bring itself to believe that one of its own could be guilty without absolute proof. Better to let a suspected traitor go free than to admit that Cambridge graduates, intelligence officers with decades of service, men who attended the right schools and knew the right people, could systematically betray their country. Philby remained in Britain for the next 12 years, working as a journalist, maintaining contact with old MI6 colleagues, and occasionally providing informal advice to the service that had supposedly dismissed him. He lived quietly in London, attracted minimal public attention, and waited. He knew that as long as he maintained his cover story and avoided providing British intelligence with concrete evidence, he could survive. And he knew that somewhere in the Soviet intelligence system, his controllers were working on plans to eventually extract him if the situation became untenable. That extraction became necessary in January 1963, when a new source provided MI6 with information that definitively identified Philby as a Soviet agent. Nicholas Elliott, Philby's friend and former MI6 colleague, flew to Beirut, where Philby was working as a correspondent for The Economist and The Observer. Elliott confronted Philby in a Beirut apartment, offering him one last chance to confess in exchange for immunity and the possibility of returning to Britain. The conversation, partially transcribed in declassified files, shows Philby making carefully calibrated admissions. He acknowledged passing some information to the Soviets, but only until 1946, and only material that he believed wouldn't harm British interests, since Britain and the Soviet Union were wartime allies. He portrayed his espionage as wartime cooperation that had ended when the alliance ended, not ongoing betrayal that continued through the early Cold War. Elliott knew Philby was still lying, but he needed a confession on record, even a partial one, to close the case officially. "Tell me about Konstantin Volkov," Elliott pressed. Volkov had been a Soviet intelligence officer in Turkey who offered to defect to Britain in 1945, bringing with him information about Soviet agents inside British intelligence. Before Britain could act on Volkov's offer, the NKVD had kidnapped him and his wife from Turkey, flown them to Moscow, and executed them in Lubyanka prison. Philby paused for a long moment, then admitted that he had warned the Soviets about Volkov's approach. It was the first concrete admission that Philby had caused someone's death through his espionage. Elliott pushed for more details, more names, more admissions. Philby promised to provide everything in writing, asked for time to prepare his statement, and agreed to meet Elliott again in a few days. The meeting never happened. On January 23, 1963, Philby boarded a Soviet freighter in Beirut harbor and sailed for Moscow. He spent the remaining 25 years of his life in the Soviet Union, married a Russian woman, received KGB honors and a generous pension, and occasionally granted interviews to Western journalists in which he defended his decision to serve the Soviet cause. He died in Moscow in 1988, still maintaining that his loyalty to communism had been morally superior to loyalty to Britain. But Philby wasn't the first or the last of the Cambridge Five to be exposed. The unravelling had begun long before his defection, and it continued long after. The story of the Cambridge Five begins not in 1951 with Maclean and Burgess's flight, but in 1934 at Cambridge University, when a small group of brilliant, privileged young men became convinced that capitalism was dying, fascism was rising, and only Soviet communism offered a viable alternative for humanity's future. They were wrong about almost everything, but their sincerity was absolute. Donald Maclean was the son of a Liberal Party cabinet minister, educated at Gresham School and Trinity Hall, Cambridge. He excelled academically, showed no outward signs of radicalism, and seemed destined for a distinguished career in the Foreign Office. But privately, he had become convinced that Western capitalism had failed, that the Depression proved democratic governments couldn't solve economic problems, and that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope for preventing another catastrophic war. Guy Burgess came from a naval family, attended Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, and possessed a photographic memory combined with complete social fearlessness. He could charm anyone, from cabinet ministers to Soviet intelligence officers, and he used those skills to move through British society while secretly working to undermine it. His open homosexuality, at a time when homosexuality was illegal in Britain, should have made him a security risk. Instead, it somehow made him seem less threatening, as if his obvious personal defiance of conventional morality made political betrayal seem unlikely. Kim Philby was born in British India, son of Harry St. John Philby, the legendary explorer and advisor to Arabian kings. He inherited his father's independence of thought and willingness to defy convention. Where his father chose to side with Arab nationalism against British imperialism, Kim Philby chose to side with Soviet communism against Western capitalism. Both men believed they were serving higher ideals that transcended national loyalty. Anthony Blunt was several years older than the others, a Trinity College fellow who became an art historian of genuine distinction. He was recruited first by Soviet intelligence officer Arnold Deutsch in 1934, and he in turn identified and facilitated the recruitment of the others. Blunt combined intellectual brilliance with an ability to evaluate people's susceptibility to recruitment. He recognized in Philby, Burgess, and Maclean the combination of ideological commitment, professional ambition, and moral flexibility that made them ideal long-term intelligence assets. John Cairncross, the fifth member, though he never met most of the others, came from a Scottish middle-class background, studied modern languages at the Sorbonne and Trinity College, Cambridge, and resented the class system that made him feel perpetually inferior despite his obvious talents. His resentment made him receptive to Soviet recruitment, and his linguistic skills made him valuable. During the war, he worked at Bletchley Park, Britain's code-breaking centre, where he had access to decrypted German military communications that he promptly passed to his Soviet handlers. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited them, Arnold Deutsch and Theodore Marley, were professionals who understood that the best agents weren't mercenaries motivated by money, but true believers motivated by ideology. They never explicitly asked the Cambridge students to betray Britain. Instead, they framed recruitment as joining a noble cause, fighting fascism, helping to build a better world. The fact that this noble cause required stealing British secrets and passing them to a foreign power was presented as unfortunate necessity, not moral betrayal, and critically, they structured the network to minimize risk. The five men didn't operate as a cohesive group. Most never met each other. Each had individual Soviet handlers, separate communication protocols, different operational security measures. If one was exposed, the others might survive. The network was designed for long-term penetration, not short-term intelligence gathering. The Soviets were willing to wait years for their Cambridge recruits to reach positions of real value. The wait paid off spectacularly. By the early 1940s, all five had infiltrated critical positions in the British government. Blunt joined MI5 in 1940, giving him access to British counterintelligence operations and the identities of Soviet agents operating in Britain. He could warn Moscow about any British operations targeting Soviet intelligence, effectively neutralizing British counter-espionage efforts against the USSR. Maclean entered the Foreign Office, where his intellectual brilliance and impeccable background guaranteed steady promotion. By 1944, he was posted to the British Embassy in Washington as First Secretary, with special responsibility for atomic energy cooperation between Britain, America, and Canada. He attended meetings where the Manhattan Project's progress was discussed in detail, where uranium availability was calculated, where post-war nuclear weapons policy was debated. Everything he learned, he transmitted to Moscow through his Soviet handlers. The intelligence Maclean provided about the atomic bomb was extraordinarily valuable. Soviet scientists working on their own atomic program had limited information about Western technical approaches, production difficulties, and strategic thinking. Maclean's reports allowed them to avoid certain research dead ends, estimate how quickly the Americans could produce additional weapons, and understand Western strategic assumptions about nuclear warfare. His espionage didn't give the Soviets the atomic bomb, but it significantly accelerated their program and saved them enormous resources. Philby joined MI6 in 1940 and rose rapidly through the service, demonstrating exactly the combination of analytical skill and operational effectiveness his superiors wanted. By 1944, he headed Section 9, the counterintelligence section specifically responsible for Soviet operations. The irony was absolute. The person responsible for defending Britain against Soviet espionage was himself a Soviet agent who could inform Moscow about every British operation targeting Soviet intelligence. Philby's position allowed him to protect the entire Cambridge network. Whenever British or American intelligence services began investigating someone who might lead to the Cambridge Five, Philby could subtly redirect inquiries, cast doubt on evidence, suggest alternative explanations. He was the guardian of the entire operation, and he executed that role with consummate skill for more than a decade. Burgess worked for the BBC, then briefly for MI6 and the Special Operations Executive, before joining the Foreign Office in 1944. His contribution wasn't analytical brilliance or access to single critical programs, but rather a gift for networking that gave him information about British policy across multiple departments. He knew everyone, attended every important social function, and extracted information through charm and alcohol rather than formal intelligence channels. Cairncross worked at the Treasury, then transferred to Bletchley Park in 1942, where he had access to Britain's greatest intelligence triumph, the decryption of German Enigma communications. He systematically photographed decrypted German military orders and passed them to the Soviets, giving Stalin advance warning of German military operations. His intelligence contribution to the Battle of Kursk in 1943 was significant enough that Soviet commanders could position their forces to counter German offensives they knew were coming. The volume of material the Cambridge Five transmitted to Moscow was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, they passed more than 20,000 classified documents to Soviet intelligence. Blunt alone provided 1,771 documents. Burgess transmitted 4,605. Maclean provided 4,593. Cairncross sent 5,832. And Philby's total, never fully calculated, likely exceeded all the others combined. The Soviet intelligence services couldn't quite believe what they were receiving. The volume was so large, the quality so high, the access so comprehensive that KGB officers in Moscow suspected it must be British disinformation, an elaborate deception designed to feed them false information. About half the documents the Cambridge Five sent to Moscow were never even read by Soviet analysts because they assumed such perfect intelligence penetration couldn't possibly be genuine. But it was genuine, and it continued for years after the war ended, through the period when Britain and the Soviet Union transformed from wartime allies to Cold War adversaries. The Cambridge Five didn't stop when the political context changed. Their commitment was to Soviet communism, not to temporary wartime cooperation. They continued betraying British and American secrets through the late 1940s, when the stakes were arguably higher than during the war because nuclear weapons had transformed the potential consequences of intelligence failure. The beginning of the end came not from British vigilance, but from American cryptanalysis. The Venona project, begun in February 1943 by the US Army Signal Intelligence Service, was initially designed to decrypt Soviet diplomatic communications. For 3 years, cryptanalysts made no progress against Soviet one-time pad encryption, which was theoretically unbreakable. The breakthrough came in 1946 when analysts discovered that some encryption keys had been reused by Soviet code clerks, a violation of protocol that created vulnerabilities in what should have been perfect security. Between 1946 and 1951, Venona cryptanalysts slowly decrypted portions of approximately 3,000 Soviet intelligence messages from the 1940s. The messages used code names rather than real names, but they contained enough contextual information to identify several agents. Homer, with his wife's pregnancy in 1944 and his access to atomic information from Washington, could only be Donald McLean. Other messages pointed to Soviet penetration of Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, and various levels of the US government. But Venona had a critical security problem. The project was so secret that even President Truman wasn't fully briefed on its existence. The FBI and military intelligence officers who controlled Venona decided that sharing information with British intelligence risked compromising the project if the British services were themselves penetrated. They shared only what was absolutely necessary, and only with specific trusted individuals in MI6. Kim Philby was one of those trusted individuals, which meant the Soviets learned about Venona almost as soon as it began producing useful intelligence. Philby couldn't tell his Soviet handlers everything without revealing himself, but he could provide enough information for Moscow to understand that old encryption had been compromised and that Soviet agents identified in decrypted messages needed to be warned or extracted. After Burgess and McLean fled in 1951, British intelligence began systematic investigation of everyone associated with them. Philby was the obvious suspect, but proving it required evidence beyond association and circumstance. The interrogations produced nothing conclusive. Philby's resignation resolved the immediate political crisis with the Americans, but left the fundamental question unanswered. How many more Soviet agents remained inside British intelligence? The answer came slowly, through multiple sources over many years. In 1963, after Philby's defection, MI5 intensified its investigation of everyone connected to the Cambridge network. They had a new source, Michael Straight, an American who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while a student at Cambridge in the 1930s. Straight had broken with the Soviets in 1941, but had never revealed his recruitment. In 1963, facing a background check for a position in the Kennedy administration, Straight decided to confess. He named Anthony Blunt as his recruiter. MI5 Officer Arthur Martin confronted Blunt in his flat above the Courtauld Institute on April 23, 1964. The transcript of that interrogation, declassified in 2015, shows Blunt's careful calculation. Martin offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for full confession. Blunt understood that this was probably his last chance to avoid criminal charges, so he admitted to Soviet recruitment in the 1930s, acknowledged passing information to Moscow during the war, and named several other people he had identified as potential recruits. But even in confession, Blunt held back information. Martin wrote in his report that although the conversation felt natural, at no time was Blunt at ease. Every answer followed a long pause during which Blunt seemed to be calculating what he could safely admit. He claimed his active intelligence work had ended in 1945, that he had no contact with Soviet handlers after the war except for helping Burgess and McLean escape in 1951. Martin didn't believe him, but accepted the confession as sufficient to close the case officially. The arrangement that followed was extraordinary. Blunt remained as surveyor of the Queen's pictures, responsible for the royal collection, a position he had held since 1945. The Queen herself wasn't informed about Blunt's confession until 1973, and even then she was told only that he had spied during wartime, not that his espionage had continued through the early Cold War. Blunt retained his knighthood, continued his academic work, and lived quietly at the heart of the British establishment for another 15 years. The secrecy couldn't last forever. In 1979, journalist Andrew Boyle published Climate of Treason, a book about the Cambridge spies that included a character obviously modelled on Blunt, called Maurice, in reference to E.M. Forster's novel about a gay man. The identification was transparent enough that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, newly elected and incensed by the cover-up, publicly revealed Blunt's confession in the House of Commons in November 1979. The revelation destroyed what remained of Blunt's public reputation. He was stripped of his knighthood, forced to resign from his academic positions, and lived the final 4 years of his life as a pariah, shunned by the same establishment that had protected him for decades. He died in 1983, bitter about his treatment, but still insisting that his commitment to communism had been morally justified by the need to fight fascism. Cairncross, the last of the 5 to be publicly identified, lived a quieter final chapter. He had been confronted about his espionage in 1951, had admitted some activities, and had been allowed to resign rather than face prosecution. He worked for the United Nations, lived in various countries, and wasn't publicly named as the 5th man until 1981. Unlike the others, he expressed genuine remorse in later years, saying he had been naive about Soviet totalitarianism and hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions. He died in 1995, having never faced criminal charges. The damage the Cambridge Five inflicted on British intelligence was measured not just in stolen secrets, but in destroyed trust. American intelligence services lost confidence in British security, which strained the special relationship that was supposed to bind the two nations together through the Cold War. Information sharing became limited, joint operations were restricted, and American officials who might previously have shared intelligence with their British counterparts now asked whether those counterparts might themselves be Soviet agents. The damage within British intelligence services was even more profound. If men like Philby, with his background and credentials and years of exemplary service, could be Soviet agents, then who else might be compromised? The paranoia that followed shaped British intelligence operations for decades. Genuine officers fell under suspicion because of minor associations or innocent circumstances that could be twisted to suggest Soviet recruitment. The Cambridge Five didn't just steal secrets, they poisoned the atmosphere of trust that intelligence services require to function effectively. The broader cultural damage was harder to quantify, but perhaps more lasting. The Cambridge Five embodied the failure of the British class system's central assumption that privilege, education, and proper upbringing guaranteed loyalty and moral character. The establishment had believed that men who attended Cambridge, who spoke with the right accents, who knew the right people, and belonged to the right clubs, could be trusted implicitly. The revelation that 5 such men had systematically betrayed everything their class represented shattered that assumption permanently. The scandal exposed the weakness of security systems based on social class rather than professional vetting. Background checks had been perfunctory because good background was assumed to be sufficient. Anyone who asked inconvenient questions about candidates from the right families was seen as showing bad judgment and poor understanding of how British society functioned. The Cambridge Five proved that this system was worse than inadequate. It was actively dangerous. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy was the realization that none of the 5 had ever recanted. Maclean and Burgess lived in Moscow until their deaths in the 1980s, never expressing regret. Philby remained committed to Soviet communism even after he saw firsthand the brutality and failure of the system he had served. Blunt, forced to live in disgrace after his exposure, still maintained that fighting fascism had justified his betrayal. Cairncross came closest to admitting error, but even he framed his regret in terms of naivete rather than moral failure. They had been convinced in the 1930s that capitalism was dying, that democratic governments couldn't address economic crisis, that only Soviet communism offered hope for humanity's future. History proved them catastrophically wrong on every point, but their ideological certainty had been strong enough to override national loyalty, personal relationships, and basic honesty for decades. They weren't cynical mercenaries selling secrets for money. They were true believers who convinced themselves that betrayal served a higher purpose. The Venona project, which had exposed them, was itself declassified only in 1995, 52 years after it began. The full transcripts revealed that American and British cryptanalysts had decrypted only about 3,000 messages out of more than 700,000 Soviet intelligence communications they had intercepted. 3,000 messages exposed the Cambridge Five, Julius Rosenberg, Klaus Fuchs, and dozens of other Soviet agents. What remained hidden in the 697,000 messages never decrypted? How many other agents operated successfully for years, passed their intelligence, and were never identified because their communications remained encrypted? The question haunted intelligence officers for decades and contributed to the paranoia that characterized Cold War counterintelligence. Every unexplained security failure, every successful Soviet operation, every leak of classified information raised the question: are there more Cambridge Fives still operating, still passing secrets, still protected by the assumption that certain backgrounds guarantee loyalty? Today, the Cambridge Five are studied in intelligence training programs as examples of catastrophic security failure. The lessons seem obvious in retrospect. Don't rely on social class as security clearance. Don't assume ideology can't override national loyalty. Don't mistake surface charm for genuine reliability. But at the time, these lessons contradicted everything the British establishment believed about itself and its natural right to govern. The buildings where they studied at Cambridge still stand, beautiful and privileged, training new generations of students who will enter government service, intelligence work, diplomatic careers. The portraits of distinguished alumni hang in college halls, though now they're more carefully vetted to avoid honouring traitors. The system that produced the Cambridge Five has been reformed, modernised, subjected to professional security protocols that the 1930s establishment would have considered insulting to gentlemen. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. How do intelligence services protect themselves against people who believe, with absolute sincerity, that betraying their country serves a higher purpose? How do you detect agents who aren't motivated by money or coercion, but by ideology so strong it redefines loyalty itself? The Cambridge Five proved that education, intelligence, and privilege don't prevent betrayal. Sometimes they enable it by creating the arrogance to believe that personal ideology should override institutional duty. The last of the Cambridge Five died more than 30 years ago. The Soviet Union they served collapsed in 1991, proving definitively that their ideological commitment had been to a failed system that produced tyranny rather than utopia. The secrets they stole shaped the Cold War in ways that killed people, destabilized regions, and brought the world closer to nuclear war. And yet, in the final analysis, they probably believed they had been right to do what they did. That certainty, that absolute conviction that personal ideology justifies betrayal of every institutional and personal loyalty, is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Cambridge Five. Not the secrets they stole, but the demonstration that brilliant, educated, privileged people can convince themselves that betrayal serves nobility, that lies serve truth, that breaking every oath taken serves a higher purpose that exists only in their own imagination. The Cambridge scandal doesn't have a neat conclusion because some of its consequences continue echoing today, whenever intelligence services confront the question of how to identify ideological betrayal before it destroys institutional trust. Whenever intelligence services confront the question of how to identify ideological betrayal before it destroys institutional trust.